the memorial stone down at the tiny Grace Chapel Cemetery of Frank Bud Smith sits in the midst of some other veterans' stones. One was Willie Dan Brown, veteran of World War I, and then Frank Bud Smith from World War II, Herschel Tate from the Korean War, and Raymond Eubanks Jr. from the Vietnam War. So Beersheba, small as it is, has contributed, if you can call it that, its part in the defense of our nation. And we have suffered casualties in doing that. We moved to Nashville there in 1942 because my dad had secured work at a defense plant called Vultee Aircraft. When we left the little greenhouse, as everyone called it, here in Beersheba Springs, it had no electricity. Now, 2 years later, we returned and lived in the same house. It still had no electricity. And I thought it was quite interesting why that little house did not have electricity. Electricity came to Beersheba Springs on August the 26th, 1941. And the reason that I have that date so handy is because my grandmother, Rollins, on my mother's side, told me that it came to Altamont and Beersheba at the same time on my sister's first birthday. But back to why the house did not have electricity, my grandfather owned a lot of property other than the 1,000 acres. He had acquired, I just don't know about the other, but I know that he owned land halfway from here to Altamont. And as the electric company came around trying to get permits to put poles and lines on people's property, my grandfather, who thought a man's worth in life could be valued by his acreage, refused to sign a permit. He said it was just a gimmick to get people's land. So it delayed electricity coming to Beersheba. They got midway, a place out here we call the log dump. It actually is between what is now the city limits of Beersheba and the city limits of Altamont. And at that point, to go any farther along the highway, they would have got on my grandfather's land either side of the road. So they made a 90-degree turn there and went up in what we call Besttown. Then the power line came back down through the Utah community and back onto Highway 56 near where what they call the Henry Myers place. Bobby Joe Thompson lives across the road there and has an archery shop, and the line continued then down with Highway 56, but when it got to the Grace Chapel curve, we call it, it had to go on the left-hand side of the road to avoid getting onto my grandfather's property. On the north side, I guess you'd say, of Highway 56. It goes in behind the Eddie Brown house and in behind the Cagle house there and down through the field there that belongs to Alf Adams. Now, there's lines all over the place now, but that's where the original power line ran. And the reason was it stayed off of my grandpa's land. Well, sort of humorous, he decided that he wanted have electricity. When it first came on, it only stayed on a few minutes. They called it electric lights. Nobody had an appliance or even knew what one was. They called it electric lights, and I remember they had a $3 minimum charge for people to sign up for electricity. Even though we didn't have it, that was the going charge way on up into the years, and you had to pay $3 whether you burned it or not. So anyway, I
think that was $3 a month.
$3 a month, yes. My grandfather decided that he was right after the electricity went off a few minutes after it came on. And he went around telling people, now, I told you, now where's your land? Your land is gone. Well, it came back on, has been on ever since then, except for some outages during storms and things. Finally, my grandfather decided he would like to have electricity himself. And the board, which was a co-op, the Sequatchie Valley Co-op, had regular meetings and voted on matters. And when his application came up, they found it convenient to disallow or turn him down. And that went on for several meetings. I don't know just how long, but it went on for 2 or 3 years. But finally, Mr. Dennis Brown told me personally, I had heard the story, and I got to see Dennis a short time before he passed away, and I asked him about this, and he confirmed it. He said, yes, I was on the board, and said Minnie and Susan had asked me about voting for them to get electricity, and I don't know who all had voted against him, but anyway, Dennis persuaded the others to vote positive because of Minnie and Susan. Otherwise, I guess my grandfather would have died in the dark because he cost them a lot of money and caused a lot of delay. Well, we moved down to Nashville in '42, and my dad had been able to get an automobile. Automobiles were really getting scarce. I have a letter that my dad wrote to his brother in McMinnville when he was trying to buy a car. His brother was going to finance it for him, and the Chevrolet dealer in McMinnville only had one car in stock. And it was not a Chevrolet, it was a Packard. And he told my Uncle BB that he could find a Chevrolet in Nashville, but it ended up he did get one in McMinnville finally, a car that was a couple of years old that had wrecked, had hit a mule. And the man that wanted to get back on the road, he hauled a coal miner, so he managed to get a new one in about that time. Anyway, my dad got the old one when it was picked up, and we kept it for many years. My dad worked at Bull T Aircraft. It later became Dalco out near the airport, and we would go out to pick him up from work, and I observed something that I just thought was the most unusual thing I ever seen. Women wearing pants. It looked as unusual as it does today to see a woman wearing a dress. They were wearing dark blue slacks, they called them, with matching blouses. And we would be there as they would exit the building when they had a shift change. And I actually believe there were more women, all I know there was, more women working in the defense plant there in Nashville than there were men. During the time we lived in Nashville, My mother was a great musician. My dad was earning good wages, and he went to a place that I later learned had Beersheba Springs connections to the Claude P. Street Piano Company, and bought my mother a real nice upright piano. It had a cherry veneer finish. It was just a beautiful piece of furniture as well as a good musical instrument. And in 1944, by the way, this Mr. Street, I think, once owned the Glasgow Cottage here in Beersheba Springs and lived there. And the piano weighed a ton, I'll tell you. We came back to Beersheba when I was 5 years old, 1944, because my dad had received a call for the Army. And so we moved back to the same house, and still no electricity there. We sort of had to step back in time, because in Niceville we not only had electricity, we had an indoor bathroom and hot water and a telephone and a lot of things we had down there. But we moved back, we went back to the way we had left. My dad was gone about 6 months. The day he left to go to be examined, he left from Tracy City on a train. And I remember taking him out there early in the morning. And I cried the entire day. I cried. It was like a death sentence to be called to the Army. I had heard the war news, and all I could ever hear about that I really understood was the number of casualties, the number of men that had been killed. And I thought when you went in the Army that was final. You wouldn't be coming back. Well, my dad came back in about 6 months because he had medical problems. He never did actually go into the battle overseas. While Dad was gone, we lived in that little house, and we'd have the doors open to get a breeze, and we'd have the windows up. The air was clean in Beersheba Springs at that time. There was no factories, and TV, radio waves didn't crowd the airways. It was just wonderful. You could hear from Beersheba Springs, you could hear the train at Palmer. I remember hearing the trains, and I thought that the track must not be more than a mile away, back in the direction of Palmer, because I could hear it so plainly. But anyway, during that era, my mother would play the piano, and someone would knock on her door in the evening hours and say, Junior Meeks would love to hear the Coconut Grove. Well, we would step out onto the porch and look out in the highway, and there would be 10, possibly 12 young men lying out in the highway on their back with their hands behind their head for a pillow, listening to the concert. She played ragtime piano, and they loved it. That was a wonderful time of life in Beersheba Springs, even though it was wartime. I remember, Clopper, the day the war was declared over, 1945, and everybody wanted